Question 1. The assessment process reveals that a client in Birmingham, Alabama, facing a misdemeanor theft charge, informs their legal representative that they possess a receipt for the item in question, but it was misplaced. The client then suggests they could find a similar receipt from a store that would appear to be for the item, to present as evidence of legitimate purchase. What is the most appropriate course of action for the legal representative under Alabama Commonwealth Law? Option A. Instruct the client to discard any existing receipts and focus solely on witness testimony, without addressing the suggestion of creating a new receipt. Option B. Advise the client that presenting a fabricated receipt would constitute a criminal offense under Alabama law, specifically obstruction of justice and tampering with evidence, and explain that such an action would severely jeopardize their defense and could lead to further criminal charges. Option C. Immediately inform the client that fabricating evidence is illegal and then proceed to file the fabricated receipt with the court, assuming the prosecution will not discover it. Option D. Advise the client that while fabricating evidence is generally frowned upon, it is a common practice in some jurisdictions and can be effective if done carefully. Correct answer is B. Advise the client that presenting a fabricated receipt would constitute a criminal offense under Alabama law, specifically obstruction of justice and tampering with evidence, and explain that such an action would severely jeopardize their defense and could lead to further criminal charges. Explanation. The assessment process reveals a scenario that is professionally challenging due to the inherent conflict between a client's stated desire and the legal and ethical obligations of a legal professional. The requirement for careful judgment stems from the need to uphold the integrity of the legal system while advocating for the client's interests within the bounds of the law. Misinterpreting or misapplying Alabama criminal law in this context could lead to severe professional consequences, including disciplinary action and damage to the client's case. The correct approach involves a thorough understanding and application of Alabama's criminal statutes and evidentiary rules. This approach prioritizes advising the client on the legal ramifications of their proposed actions, explaining the elements of the offense they are considering, and outlining the potential defenses available under Alabama law. It requires the professional to act as a legal counselor, guiding the client toward lawful conduct and realistic legal strategies, rather than facilitating or encouraging illegal activity. This aligns with the ethical duty to represent clients diligently and competently, within the framework of the law, as mandated by the Alabama State Bar Rules of Professional Conduct, particularly those concerning candor toward the tribunal and the prohibition against assisting in criminal or fraudulent conduct. An incorrect approach would be to directly assist the client in fabricating evidence. This is a direct violation of Alabama criminal law, specifically statutes related to obstruction of justice and tampering with evidence. Ethically, this action would constitute assisting in criminal or fraudulent conduct, a clear breach of professional responsibility under the Alabama State Bar Rules. Another incorrect approach would be to ignore the client's stated intent and proceed with a defense strategy that is not grounded in the facts or the law, without first discussing the legal implications with the client. This demonstrates a lack of diligence and a failure to adequately counsel the client, potentially leading to ineffective representation and a violation of the duty to communicate. Finally, an incorrect approach would be to advise the client that their proposed action, while potentially illegal, is a minor issue that can be easily overlooked or dismissed by the court. This misrepresents the seriousness of criminal offenses under Alabama law and fails to provide the client with accurate legal advice, thereby breaching the duty of competence and candor. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a clear identification of the client's objective. This is followed by a comprehensive assessment of the objective's legality under Alabama law. If the objective is illegal, the professional must clearly explain the legal prohibitions and potential consequences to the client. The next step is to explore lawful alternatives that might achieve a similar outcome for the client. Throughout this process, maintaining open communication and ensuring the client understands the legal landscape is paramount. Question 2. The risk matrix shows a potential misalignment between a client's stated desire for aggressive growth and their expressed risk tolerance in the Alabama market. The client has indicated a strong preference for high-return investments, but also a low tolerance for potential losses. How should a financial advisor proceed to ensure compliance with Alabama Commonwealth law and ethical obligations? Option A. Advise the client that their risk tolerance is too low for their desired growth objectives and unilaterally implement a highly conservative investment plan. Option B. Recommend a complex, high-risk investment product that promises aggressive growth without fully detailing the potential for significant capital depreciation. Option C. Proceed with the client's aggressive growth strategy as requested, assuming their stated preference is the sole determinant of appropriate action. Option D. Conduct a deeper dive into the client's financial capacity to absorb losses. Re-explain the risks and potential rewards of aggressive strategies in the context of their stated tolerance, and document all discussions and recommendations thoroughly. The correct answer is D. Conduct a deeper dive into the client's financial capacity to absorb losses. Re-explain the risks and potential rewards of aggressive strategies in the context of their stated tolerance, and document all discussions and recommendations thoroughly. Explanation. The risk matrix shows a potential conflict between a client's stated investment goals and their stated risk tolerance, particularly concerning their desire for aggressive growth in a volatile market. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires the financial advisor to navigate the delicate balance between client autonomy and their fiduciary duty to act in the client's best interest, adhering strictly to Alabama Commonwealth law. Careful judgment is required to ensure that recommendations are not only aligned with the client's stated preferences, but also prudent and compliant with constitutional interpretations that guide regulatory frameworks. The best professional approach involves a thorough reevaluation of the client's financial situation and objectives, coupled with a clear, documented explanation of the inherent risks associated with their desired investment strategy. This includes referencing how Alabama's constitutional provisions, as interpreted by state courts and regulatory bodies, mandate a duty of care and suitability. The advisor must ensure the client fully understands the potential downsides and that the proposed strategy, while potentially aggressive, is still within the bounds of what a prudent investor might consider, given their overall financial picture. This aligns with the principle that, while clients have the right to make their own decisions, advisors have a responsibility to guide them toward choices that are both informed and appropriate, preventing them from making decisions that could lead to significant financial harm due to a misunderstanding of risk. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with the client's aggressive growth request without further due diligence, assuming the client's stated preference overrides any concerns about suitability or risk. This fails to uphold the advisor's duty of care, which is implicitly derived from constitutional principles of fairness and protection against undue harm. Another incorrect approach is to dismiss the client's goals outright and impose an overly conservative strategy without adequate discussion or justification, which disrespects client autonomy and may not be in their best long-term interest if their goals are achievable through appropriately managed risk. Finally, recommending a strategy that is demonstrably outside the client's capacity to absorb losses, even if framed as aggressive growth, would violate the spirit of prudent advice and could lead to regulatory scrutiny under Alabama's consumer protection statutes, which are informed by constitutional mandates for just and equitable dealings. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes understanding the client's complete financial picture, including their capacity for risk, not just their stated tolerance. This involves open communication, thorough documentation of discussions and recommendations, and a commitment to providing advice that is both suitable and compliant with all applicable laws and ethical standards, particularly those derived from the interpretation of constitutional provisions ensuring fair practice. Question 3. The control framework reveals a scenario where a real estate licensee in Alabama is reviewing the requirements for disclosing property defects. While the Alabama Real Estate License Act outlines general disclosure obligations, the specific details regarding the format and content of the disclosure statement are found in the Alabama Real Estate Commission's rules and regulations. Which of the following best reflects the legal standing of these detailed disclosure requirements? Option A. Only requirements explicitly stated within the Alabama Real Estate License Act are legally binding for property defect disclosures. Option B. The detailed disclosure requirements, as established by the Alabama Real Estate Commission's rules and regulations, have the force of law and must be followed by licensees. Option C. The licensee may choose to follow either the Alabama Real Estate License Act or the Alabama Real Estate Commission's rules and regulations, as long as they provide some form of disclosure. Option D. The detailed disclosure requirements are merely advisory guidelines and do not carry the same legal weight as the Alabama Real Estate License Act. The correct answer is B. The detailed disclosure requirements, as established by the Alabama Real Estate Commission's rules and regulations, have the force of law and must be followed by licensees. Explanation: the control framework reveals a common challenge in real estate transactions, ensuring compliance with evolving regulations. In Alabama, the Alabama Real Estate Commission, AREC, is empowered to create rules and regulations that supplement the statutes passed by the legislature. These are forms of delegated legislation. The professional challenge lies in accurately identifying the source of authority for specific requirements and ensuring adherence to the most current and applicable rules. Misinterpreting the source of authority or failing to stay updated can lead to violations. The correct approach involves recognizing that the Alabama Real Estate License Act, ARELA, grants the AREC the authority to promulgate rules and regulations. Therefore, when a specific requirement, such as the detailed content of a listing agreement or the procedures for handling earnest money deposits, is not explicitly detailed in the ARELA itself, but is found in the AREC rules and regulations, those rules have the force of law. This approach is correct because it acknowledges the statutory delegation of rulemaking authority and treats the AREC regulations as binding legal requirements. Adhering to these rules ensures compliance with the full scope of Alabama's real estate regulatory framework. An incorrect approach would be to disregard a requirement solely because it is found in the AREC rules and regulations and not explicitly in the ARELA statutes. This fails to recognize the AREC delegated legislative authority. Another incorrect approach would be to rely on outdated versions of the AREC rules and regulations, assuming they have not been amended. This is a failure of due diligence and can lead to noncompliance with current legal standards. Finally, assuming that any practice not explicitly prohibited by statute is permissible without considering the AREC regulatory powers, ignores the comprehensive nature of delegated legislation in governing professional conduct. Professionals should employ a decision-making process that begins with identifying the relevant statutes. If a specific issue is not fully addressed in the statute, the next step is to consult the regulations promulgated by the relevant regulatory body. In this case, the AREC. This involves actively seeking out the most current versions of these regulations and understanding that they have the same legal weight as the statutes they supplement. A commitment to ongoing professional development and staying informed about regulatory updates is crucial. Question 4. Compliance review shows that a client of a registered firm in Alabama has expressed dissatisfaction with a recent investment recommendation and has stated their intention to contact the Alabama Securities Commission's ombudsman to file a formal complaint. What is the most appropriate and compliant course of action for the firm and its registered representatives? Option A. Advise the client that they must first exhaust all internal firm complaint resolution procedures before considering any external contact. Option B. Provide the client with the direct contact information for the Alabama Securities Commission's ombudsman and acknowledge their right to pursue this avenue. Option C. Discourage the client from contacting the ombudsman, emphasizing that internal resolution will be faster and more effective. Option D. Refuse to provide any information about the ombudsman and insist that all communication regarding the complaint must remain strictly within the firm. The correct answer is B. Provide the client with the direct contact information for the Alabama Securities Commission's ombudsman and acknowledge their right to pursue this avenue. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it involves a potential conflict between a firm's internal processes and the statutory rights of a client to seek external recourse. Navigating this requires a deep understanding of the Alabama Securities Act and the ethical obligations of licensees to facilitate, not hinder, client access to regulatory oversight and accountability mechanisms. The firm's desire to resolve issues internally must be balanced against the client's right to engage with the Alabama Securities Commission's ombudsman. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice is to acknowledge the client's request to contact the ombudsman and provide them with the necessary information to do so. This approach respects the client's autonomy and adheres to the spirit and letter of Alabama's regulatory framework, which establishes the ombudsman as a vital accountability mechanism. By facilitating the client's access, the firm demonstrates transparency and a commitment to regulatory compliance, recognizing that the ombudsman's role is to investigate complaints and ensure fair practices. Incorrect approach is analysis. Discouraging the client from contacting the ombudsman, even with the promise of internal resolution, is professionally unacceptable. This action can be interpreted as an attempt to obstruct a client's access to a statutory oversight body, potentially violating provisions of the Alabama Securities Act that govern fair dealing and prohibit deceptive practices. It undermines the accountability function of the ombudsman, suggesting the client should first exhaust all internal complaint procedures before considering external options, without explicitly stating that the ombudsman is an available recourse, is also problematic. While internal resolution is often encouraged, it should not be presented as a mandatory prerequisite that prevents a client from exercising their right to engage with the ombudsman. This could delay or deter a client from seeking necessary external review. Directly refusing to provide contact information for the ombudsman and insisting on only internal resolution is a clear violation of regulatory expectations. This demonstrates a lack of cooperation with regulatory oversight and a failure to uphold the client's right to seek assistance from the designated accountability office within the Alabama Securities Commission. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach such situations by prioritizing transparency and client rights. The decision-making process should involve 1. Identifying the client's expressed need or concern. 2. Recalling the client's statutory rights, including the right to engage with regulatory bodies like the Alabama Securities Commission's ombudsman. 3. Evaluating internal firm policies against these statutory rights, ensuring internal processes do not impede external recourse. 4. Communicating openly with the client, acknowledging their request and providing accurate information about available avenues for resolution, including regulatory options. 5. Documenting all interactions and decisions. Question 5. Governance review demonstrates that a real estate licensee in Alabama is facing potential disciplinary action from the Alabama Real Estate Commission due to alleged violations of professional conduct. The Commission is considering several approaches to address the matter. Which approach best upholds the principles of natural justice and the right to a fair hearing for the licensee? Option A. Notifying the licensee of general categories of misconduct, without specifying the exact nature of the alleged violations or the supporting evidence. Option B. Issuing a disciplinary action based on the initial findings of the investigation without further consultation with the licensee, assuming the evidence is sufficient. Option C. Providing the licensee with detailed written notice of the specific allegations and the evidence gathered, along with a clear opportunity to respond, present evidence, and be represented by counsel before any final decision is rendered. Option D. Conducting the hearing with a predetermined outcome based on initial impressions, limiting the licensee's ability to present their full defense. The correct answer is C. Providing the licensee with detailed written notice of the specific allegations and the evidence gathered, along with a clear opportunity to respond, present evidence, and be represented by counsel before any final decision is rendered. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it involves a potential conflict between the need for efficient administrative action and the fundamental right to a fair hearing, a cornerstone of natural justice. A real estate licensee in Alabama must navigate the delicate balance of upholding regulatory integrity while ensuring due process for individuals facing disciplinary action. Failure to adhere to natural justice principles can lead to overturned decisions, reputational damage, and potential legal repercussions for the licensee and the Alabama Real Estate Commission. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves ensuring that any individual facing potential disciplinary action by the Alabama Real Estate Commission is provided with adequate notice of the charges and a meaningful opportunity to present their case. This includes informing them of the specific allegations, the evidence supporting those allegations, and the right to be heard, to present evidence, and to be represented by counsel. This approach aligns directly with the principles of natural justice enshrined in Alabama law and administrative procedure, which mandate procedural fairness and the right to a hearing before an adverse decision is made. The Alabama Administrative Procedure Act, for instance, outlines requirements for notice and hearing in administrative proceedings. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves proceeding with disciplinary action based solely on a preliminary investigation report without affording the licensee an opportunity to respond to the findings. This violates the fundamental right to a fair hearing, as it presumes guilt without allowing the accused to defend themselves or challenge the evidence. Failure to provide an opportunity to be heard is a direct contravention of natural justice principles. Another incorrect approach is to provide vague or insufficient notice of the charges, making it impossible for the licensee to adequately prepare a defense. Natural justice requires that the charges be specific enough to allow the individual to understand the case against them and to respond effectively. Lack of specificity undermines the fairness of the process. A further incorrect approach is to conduct the hearing in a manner that is biased or prejudiced against the licensee. For example, by refusing to consider relevant evidence presented by the licensee or by allowing ex parte communications that influence the decision-making process. This undermines the impartiality required for a fair hearing and violates the principles of natural justice. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing such situations should adopt a systematic approach. First, identify the core principles of natural justice and fair hearing as they apply within the Alabama regulatory framework. Second, meticulously review the specific allegations and the evidence. Third, ensure all procedural requirements for notice and opportunity to be heard are strictly followed, documenting each step. Fourth, maintain impartiality throughout the process, ensuring all parties have an equal opportunity to present their case and evidence. Finally, consult relevant legal counsel or regulatory guidance if any aspect of the process is unclear or potentially contentious. Question 6. The control framework reveals that a licensed real estate broker in Alabama has encountered a unique client request that is not explicitly addressed by the Alabama Real Estate Commission's AREC rules or statutes. The broker believes they can fulfill the request in a manner that is not directly prohibited and would benefit the client, but they are unsure if it aligns with the spirit of AREC regulatory oversight. Which of the following actions best demonstrates professional judgment and adherence to regulatory compliance in this scenario? Option A. Proceeding with the client's request based on the broker's personal interpretation that since it is not explicitly forbidden, it is permissible under AREC administrative discretion. Option B. Contacting the Alabama Real Estate Commission directly to seek guidance and clarification on how to proceed with the client's request. Option C. Informing the client that the request cannot be fulfilled due to the lack of explicit guidance from AREC, thereby avoiding any potential regulatory scrutiny. Option D. Consulting with other real estate brokers in Alabama to gauge their opinions on how they would handle such a situation, assuming their practices reflect AREC general stance. Correct answer is B. Contacting the Alabama Real Estate Commission directly to seek guidance and clarification on how to proceed with the client's request. Explanation. The control framework reveals a situation where a real estate licensee in Alabama must navigate the boundaries of administrative discretion granted by the Alabama Real Estate Commission, AREC. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires the licensee to understand not only the letter of the law, but also the spirit in which AREC might interpret and apply its rules, particularly when dealing with novel or ambiguous situations. The licensee must exercise sound judgment to ensure compliance without overstepping their authority or misinterpreting the Commission's intent. The correct approach involves proactively seeking clarification from the AREC when faced with a situation that falls outside established precedents or clearly defined rules. This demonstrates a commitment to regulatory compliance and ethical conduct. By directly engaging with the governing body, the licensee ensures that their actions align with the Commission's current understanding and enforcement priorities. This proactive stance prevents potential violations and fosters a transparent working relationship with the regulator. The Alabama Real Estate License Law and AREC rules grant the Commission broad authority to interpret and enforce its regulations, and seeking guidance in ambiguous situations is the most prudent way to operate within the bounds of that discretion. An incorrect approach would be to unilaterally interpret the scope of administrative discretion as allowing for significant deviation from established practices based on personal judgment. This could lead to actions that, while perhaps appearing reasonable to the licensee, might be viewed as a violation by the AREC if they fall outside the Commission's intended application of its rules. Another incorrect approach is to assume that because a specific scenario is not explicitly prohibited, it is therefore permissible. Administrative discretion often allows the ARIC to address conduct that, while not specifically enumerated as a violation, is deemed detrimental to the public interest or the integrity of the profession. Finally, ignoring potential ethical implications and proceeding with an action solely because it is not explicitly forbidden by a rule, without considering the broader intent of the regulatory framework, is also an unacceptable approach. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes understanding the regulatory intent, seeking clarification when ambiguity exists, and erring on the side of caution when interpreting the scope of administrative discretion. This involves a continuous learning process regarding ARIC pronouncements and enforcement actions, and a willingness to engage with the Commission rather than making assumptions about its discretionary powers. Question 7. The control framework reveals that a licensed real estate broker in Alabama has received a formal complaint from the Alabama Real Estate Commission, ARIC, alleging misrepresentation in a property listing. The broker believes the complaint is unfounded, but is unsure of the best course of action to address the ARIC inquiry. Which of the following approaches best aligns with regulatory compliance and professional responsibility in Alabama? Option A. Ignore the complaint, hoping it will be dismissed due to lack of follow-up from the ARIC. Option B. Submit a brief, unverified denial of the allegations without providing any supporting documentation or engaging legal counsel. Option C. Attempt to contact the ARIC investigator directly to offer a settlement payment without formally responding to the complaint. Option D. Promptly acknowledge the complaint, gather all transaction-related documentation, and prepare a detailed, factual response with the assistance of legal counsel experienced in Alabama real estate administrative law. The correct answer is D. Promptly acknowledge the complaint, gather all transaction-related documentation, and prepare a detailed, factual response with the assistance of legal counsel experienced in Alabama real estate administrative law. Explanation. The control framework reveals a situation where a licensed real estate broker in Alabama faces a potential violation of the Alabama Real Estate License Law due to alleged misrepresentation in a property listing. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires the broker to navigate the complex administrative process of responding to a formal complaint, balancing the need to defend their actions with the imperative to comply with regulatory procedures and ethical obligations. A misstep in this process could lead to disciplinary action, including fines, license suspension, or revocation. The correct approach involves a thorough and transparent engagement with the Alabama Real Estate Commission, ARIC. This means promptly acknowledging the complaint, gathering all relevant documentation pertaining to the transaction, and preparing a detailed, factual response that directly addresses each allegation. The broker should consult with legal counsel experienced in administrative law and real estate regulations in Alabama to ensure their response is legally sound and strategically advantageous. This approach is correct because it aligns with the principles of due process and regulatory compliance mandated by Alabama law. The ARIC authority to investigate and adjudicate complaints is established, and a cooperative yet well-prepared response demonstrates good faith and respect for the regulatory process. Furthermore, it allows the broker to present their side of the story with supporting evidence, which is crucial for a fair resolution. An incorrect approach would be to ignore the complaint or delay a substantive response. This failure to engage with the ARIC process would likely be interpreted as an admission of guilt or a disregard for regulatory authority, leading to a default judgment against the broker and severe disciplinary sanctions. Another incorrect approach is to provide a misleading or incomplete response. This not only violates the duty of honesty and integrity expected of licensed professionals, but also constitutes a separate violation of the Alabama Real Estate License Law, potentially exacerbating the consequences. Finally, attempting to influence the investigation through improper means, such as offering inducements to commission staff, is a serious ethical and legal breach that would result in severe penalties. Professionals facing such situations should employ a structured decision-making process. First, they must understand the specific allegations and the relevant regulatory framework. In this case, the Alabama Real Estate License Law and ARIC rules. Second, they should assess the factual basis of the complaint and gather all supporting evidence. Third, seeking expert legal counsel specializing in Alabama administrative and real estate law is paramount. Fourth, They must formulate a response that is truthful, comprehensive, and compliant with all procedural requirements. Finally, they should maintain professional conduct throughout the entire process, even under pressure. Question 8. The control framework reveals that a financial advisor in Alabama is assisting a client who has suffered property damage due to corporate pollution and wishes to pursue legal action, but lacks the necessary funds. The client is interested in exploring public interest litigation. Which of the following actions best aligns with the advisor's professional obligations and Alabama's regulatory environment? Option A. Propose to organize other affected individuals to join the lawsuit, acting as a coordinator for potential class action participants. Option B. Advise the client to seek consultation with an Alabama licensed attorney to discuss legal options, including potential public interest litigation or class actions, and inform them about permissible funding avenues for such cases. Option C. Agree to advance the client's legal fees in exchange for a portion of any potential settlement or judgment received. Option D. Offer to connect the client with a specific attorney in exchange for a referral fee, believing this will expedite the client's access to legal representation. The correct answer is B. Advise the client to seek consultation with an Alabama licensed attorney to discuss legal options, including potential public interest litigation or class actions, and inform them about permissible funding avenues for such cases. Explanation. The control framework reveals a scenario where a financial advisor in Alabama is approached by a client who wishes to initiate a lawsuit against a large corporation for environmental damage that has affected the client's property. The client, while personally harmed, lacks the financial resources to pursue a lengthy legal battle. This situation is professionally challenging because it requires the advisor to navigate the ethical and regulatory boundaries surrounding financial advice, client representation, and the promotion of litigation, particularly when public interest is involved. The advisor must balance their fiduciary duty to the client with the strict regulations governing financial professionals and avoid engaging in activities that could be construed as the unauthorized practice of law or champerty. The best professional approach involves guiding the client towards appropriate legal counsel and resources without directly facilitating or profiting from the litigation. This means advising the client on the importance of seeking specialized legal advice from a qualified attorney in Alabama who can assess the merits of their case and explain the legal avenues available, including the possibility of public interest litigation or class actions. The advisor should also inform the client about potential funding mechanisms for litigation, such as legal aid societies or contingency fee arrangements, which are permissible under Alabama law when handled by licensed attorneys. This approach upholds the advisor's professional responsibilities by respecting the division of professional expertise, ensuring the client receives accurate legal guidance, and avoiding any actions that could violate Alabama's rules of professional conduct for financial advisors or its laws concerning the practice of law. An incorrect approach would be for the advisor to offer to connect the client with a specific attorney in exchange for a referral fee. This is problematic because it creates a financial incentive for the advisor to recommend a particular lawyer, potentially compromising their objectivity and the client's best interests. Furthermore, such an arrangement could be construed as fee-splitting with an attorney, which is generally prohibited and could violate Alabama's rules regarding the unauthorized practice of law and ethical conduct for financial professionals. Another incorrect approach would be for the advisor to suggest that they could help organize other affected individuals to join the lawsuit, effectively acting as a facilitator for a class action without being a licensed attorney. This crosses the line into the unauthorized practice of law, as organizing and soliciting parties for litigation is a legal service. Alabama law strictly prohibits individuals who are not licensed attorneys from engaging in such activities, and financial advisors are not exempt from these regulations. Finally, an incorrect approach would be for the advisor to offer to advance funds for the client's legal expenses in exchange for a percentage of any settlement or judgment. This practice, known as champerty or maintenance, is illegal in Alabama and is designed to prevent speculative litigation. Financial advisors are not permitted to finance lawsuits, as this constitutes an improper financial interest in litigation and can lead to conflicts of interest and ethical violations. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes client well-being and adhere strictly to regulatory boundaries. This involves recognizing the limits of their own expertise, understanding when to refer clients to other licensed professionals, like attorneys, and consistently acting in accordance with all applicable state laws and ethical codes. When faced with a situation that touches upon legal matters, the primary professional responsibility is to ensure the client receives competent legal advice from a qualified professional, rather than attempting to provide or facilitate legal services themselves. Question 9. Implementation of a new brokerage firm in Alabama has led to a consumer complaint alleging fraudulent misrepresentation by one of its licensed agents. The Alabama Real Estate Commission, AREC, receives this complaint. What is the most appropriate initial course of action for the AREC to take to ensure compliance with Alabama administrative law and protect the public interest? Option A. Dismiss the complaint outright as it is a single allegation, and the firm is new, assuming it is an isolated incident. Option B. Initiate a formal investigation into the allegations, provide the licensee with written notice of the complaint and the investigation, and inform them of their right to respond and request a hearing. Option C. Immediately suspend the licensee's real estate license pending a full investigation to prevent further potential harm to consumers. Option D. Contact the brokerage firm's principal broker to discuss the complaint informally and request the agent's voluntary surrender of their license. The correct answer is B. Initiate a formal investigation into the allegations, provide the licensee with written notice of the complaint and the investigation, and inform them of their right to respond and request a hearing. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires navigating the complexities of administrative law within Alabama, specifically concerning the Alabama Real Estate Commission's AREC disciplinary procedures. The challenge lies in balancing the need for prompt action to protect the public with the statutory rights afforded to licensees facing allegations. Careful judgment is required to ensure that any action taken is procedurally sound and legally defensible under Alabama law. The correct approach involves initiating a formal investigation based on the received complaint, and then providing the licensee with proper notice and an opportunity to be heard before any disciplinary action is considered or imposed. This aligns with the principles of due process guaranteed by Alabama administrative law. Specifically, the Alabama Administrative Procedure Act, APA, mandates that agencies provide notice of proposed agency action and afford parties an opportunity for a hearing. The AREC, as an administrative agency, must adhere to these procedural safeguards. This approach ensures fairness to the licensee while allowing the AREC to gather facts and make an informed decision based on evidence and established procedures. An incorrect approach would be to immediately suspend the licensee's license based solely on the complaint without conducting a thorough investigation or providing the licensee with notice and an opportunity to respond. This bypasses essential due process requirements under Alabama law, potentially leading to an unlawful suspension and legal challenges against the AREC. Another incorrect approach would be to dismiss the complaint without any investigation, even if the complaint appears credible, as this fails to fulfill the AREC duty to investigate potential violations of Alabama real estate law and protect consumers. Finally, attempting to informally resolve the matter by pressuring the licensee to surrender their license without following formal disciplinary procedures would also be an improper approach, as it circumvents the established legal framework for disciplinary actions and may not adequately address the alleged misconduct or protect the public interest. Professionals in this situation should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes adherence to statutory requirements and due process. This involves 1. Acknowledging and documenting all complaints received. 2. Initiating a preliminary investigation to assess the credibility and substance of the allegations. 3. If the investigation warrants further action, formally notifying the licensee of the allegations and their rights, including the right to a hearing. 4. Conducting a fair and impartial hearing where evidence is presented and considered. 5. Making a disciplinary decision based on the findings of the investigation and hearing, in accordance with Alabama real estate laws and AREC regulations. Question 10. To address the challenge of a client facing a potential administrative penalty in Alabama for a violation of environmental regulations, a licensee has been provided with the agency's preliminary assessment of a $50,000 fine. The relevant Alabama Code section states that the base penalty for such a violation is $10,000 and for each day the violation continues, the penalty may be increased by 10% of the base penalty, up to a maximum total penalty of $75,000. The violation has been determined to have continued for 50 days. What is the maximum legally permissible penalty the client could face under Alabama law, and what is the correct calculation to arrive at this figure? Option A. The maximum legally permissible penalty is $75,000. The calculation is base penalty of $10,000 plus 50 days asterisk 10% of the asterisk initial asterisk base penalty equals $10,000 plus 50 asterisk $1,000 equals $60,000. Since the statutory maximum is $75,000, the penalty is $75,000. Option B. The maximum legally permissible penalty is $75,000. The calculation is base penalty of $10,000 plus 50 days asterisk 10% of the asterisk cumulative asterisk penalty equals $10,000 plus 50 asterisk 10% of $10,000 equals $10,000 plus $5,000 equals $15,000, which is then capped at $75,000. Option C. The maximum legally permissible penalty is $50,000. The calculation is simply the agency's preliminary assessment, as it is presumed to be correct unless proven otherwise through a formal appeal process. Option D. The maximum legally permissible penalty is $60,000. The calculation is base penalty of $10,000 plus 50 days asterisk 10% of $10,000 equals $10,000 plus 50 asterisk $1,000 equals $10,000 plus $50,000 equals $60,000. This amount does not exceed the $75,000 statutory maximum. The correct answer is D. The maximum legally permissible penalty is $60,000. The calculation is base penalty of $10,000 plus 50 days asterisk 10% of $10,000 equals $10,000 plus 50 asterisk $1,000 equals $10,000 plus $50,000 equals $60,000. This amount does not exceed the $75,000 statutory maximum. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires a licensee to navigate the complexities of judicial review of administrative actions in Alabama, specifically concerning the calculation of penalties. The licensee must accurately apply statutory provisions and relevant case law to determine the correct penalty amount, which directly impacts the client's financial liability and the licensee's professional standing. Misinterpreting the law or misapplying mathematical principles can lead to significant financial repercussions for the client and potential disciplinary action for the licensee. The correct approach involves a precise calculation of the penalty based on the statutory framework for administrative penalties in Alabama, as interpreted by the courts. This includes identifying the base penalty, applying any statutory multipliers or reductions, and ensuring that the final amount does not exceed the statutory maximum. Specifically, the calculation should follow the Alabama Code provisions related to the administrative agency's enforcement powers and any judicial interpretations that clarify how these penalties are to be calculated. This approach is correct because it adheres strictly to the governing statutes and judicial precedent, ensuring legal compliance and accurate financial representation for the client. An incorrect approach would be to simply apply a flat percentage reduction to the initial penalty without a statutory basis. This fails to acknowledge the specific calculation methodologies prescribed by Alabama law, which may involve tiered penalties, multipliers based on the severity or duration of the violation, or specific caps. Such an approach risks underpenalizing or overpenalizing the client, leading to potential legal challenges and a breach of the licensee's duty to provide competent representation. Another incorrect approach would be to rely solely on the agency's initial assessment, without independently verifying the calculation against the Alabama Code. The agency's assessment is a starting point. It is subject to judicial review, and the licensee has a professional obligation to ensure the assessment is legally sound and mathematically accurate according to the governing statutes. Failing to do so could result in the client paying an incorrect penalty, and the licensee could be found to have provided substandard advice. A further incorrect approach would be to estimate the penalty based on similar past cases without performing a detailed calculation according to the specific facts and the relevant Alabama statutes. Each administrative action and its associated penalties are fact-specific. Relying on estimations rather than precise calculations based on the law and the client's circumstances is unprofessional and can lead to significant errors in judgment and financial advice. A professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve 1. Thoroughly understanding the specific Alabama statutes and regulations governing the administrative action and penalties. 2. Researching relevant Alabama case law that interprets these statutes, particularly concerning penalty calculation. 3. Applying the statutory framework and judicial interpretations to the specific facts of the client's case to perform a precise calculation. 4. Documenting the calculation process and the legal basis for each step. 5. Communicating the calculated penalty and the rationale to the client. Question 11. The review process indicates that a licensed real estate professional in Alabama has received a notice of hearing from the Alabama Real Estate Commission, AREC, detailing alleged violations of licensing laws. What is the most appropriate course of action for the licensee to ensure regulatory compliance and protect their license? Option A. Prepare a defense based on personal beliefs and anecdotal accounts without gathering specific documentation or evidence to support the claims. Option B. Contact the AREC investigator directly to discuss the allegations and attempt to reach an informal agreement without legal representation. Option C. Ignore the notice of hearing, assuming the matter will be dismissed if not actively pursued by the Commission. Option D. Thoroughly review the notice of hearing. Gather all relevant documentation and evidence to prepare a defense, and engage legal counsel experienced in administrative law to represent them at the hearing. The correct answer is D. Thoroughly review the notice of hearing, gather all relevant documentation and evidence to prepare a defense, and engage legal counsel experienced in administrative law to represent them at the hearing. Explanation. The review process indicates a potential violation of Alabama's administrative law concerning the licensing of real estate professionals. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a licensee to navigate the procedural safeguards afforded to them when facing disciplinary action, while also ensuring compliance with the Alabama Real Estate Commission's, AREC, established rules and regulations. A careful judgment is required to balance the licensee's right to due process with the Commission's mandate to protect the public. The correct approach involves diligently reviewing the specific allegations presented in the notice of hearing and preparing a comprehensive defense that directly addresses each point. This includes gathering all relevant documentation, identifying potential witnesses, and understanding the procedural rules governing hearings before the AREC. This approach is correct because it aligns with the fundamental principles of administrative due process, which guarantee individuals the right to notice of charges and an opportunity to be heard. Specifically, Alabama law and AREC rules mandate that licensees are entitled to a fair hearing where they can present evidence and arguments to refute allegations. By actively engaging with the hearing process and presenting a well-prepared defense, the licensee upholds their right to due process and demonstrates a commitment to regulatory compliance. An incorrect approach would be to ignore the notice of hearing, assuming the matter will resolve itself. This is professionally unacceptable because it constitutes a failure to respond to official regulatory action, which can lead to default judgments and automatic license suspension or revocation. It violates the licensee's obligation to cooperate with the AREC and disregards the seriousness of the allegations. Another incorrect approach would be to contact the AREC investigator directly to negotiate a settlement without legal counsel or a thorough understanding of the evidence. This is professionally unacceptable because it bypasses the formal hearing process and may result in an unfavorable outcome due to a lack of legal expertise or an incomplete understanding of the potential consequences. It also fails to utilize the established procedural mechanisms for dispute resolution and defense. A further incorrect approach would be to rely solely on hearsay or unsubstantiated claims to defend against the allegations without providing concrete evidence. This is professionally unacceptable because administrative hearings require the presentation of credible evidence to support defenses. Relying on weak or unverified information will likely be insufficient to overcome the charges and demonstrates a lack of preparedness and respect for the regulatory process. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes understanding the specific regulatory requirements, seeking appropriate legal counsel when facing disciplinary actions, and actively participating in the prescribed procedural avenues for defense. This involves carefully reviewing all official communications, gathering evidence, and preparing a robust response that addresses the allegations directly and in accordance with the established rules of the relevant regulatory body. Question 12. Examination of the data shows that a seller in Mobile, Alabama, sent an email to a potential buyer stating, "I am willing to sell you my vintage automobile for $15,000 with payment due upon delivery and the car to be delivered next Friday." The buyer immediately replied via email, "I accept your offer to purchase the vintage automobile for $15,000, payment due upon delivery and delivery next Friday." Based on Alabama Commonwealth Law, which of the following best describes the legal status of this exchange? Option A. A contract cannot be formed until a formal written bill of sale is signed by both parties. Option B. The seller's email was merely an invitation to negotiate and no contract has been formed. Option C. A binding contract for the sale of the automobile has been formed. Option D. The buyer's reply constituted a counteroffer, rejecting the seller's original proposal. The correct answer is C. A binding contract for the sale of the automobile has been formed. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires understanding the nuances of contract formation under Alabama law, specifically concerning the elements necessary for a legally binding agreement. The challenge lies in distinguishing between preliminary discussions or expressions of interest and a definitive offer that can be accepted to create a contract. Careful judgment is required to avoid misinterpreting communications and to ensure compliance with Alabama's contract law principles. The correct approach involves recognizing that a valid offer in Alabama must be definite in its terms and communicated to the offeree with the intent to be bound. In this case, the communication from the seller, outlining specific terms and expressing a clear willingness to enter into a contract upon acceptance, constitutes a valid offer. The buyer's subsequent communication, unequivocally agreeing to all the stated terms, signifies a valid acceptance, thereby forming a binding contract under Alabama law. This is consistent with Alabama Code Section 7-2-204, which states that a contract for sale of goods may be made in any manner sufficient to show agreement, including conduct by both parties which recognizes the existence of a contract. An incorrect approach would be to consider the initial communication as merely an invitation to negotiate. This fails to recognize that the seller's message contains specific terms and a clear intent to be bound, moving beyond a preliminary discussion. Alabama law distinguishes between an offer and an invitation to offer. The former creates the power of acceptance, while the latter does not. Another incorrect approach would be to view the buyer's response as a counteroffer. This is flawed because the buyer's communication mirrored the seller's terms exactly, without introducing any new conditions or modifications. A counteroffer, by definition, alters the terms of the original offer, thereby rejecting it and proposing a new one. Since the buyer's response was a mirror image of the seller's offer, it constituted a valid acceptance. Finally, an incorrect approach would be to assume that a contract is not formed until a formal written contract is signed by both parties. While written contracts are often advisable for clarity and evidence, Alabama law, particularly under the Uniform Commercial Code as adopted in Alabama Code Title VII, allows for contracts to be formed through oral agreements or conduct, provided the essential elements of offer, acceptance, and consideration are present, and the contract does not fall within the statute of frauds, requiring a writing for certain types of agreements. In this scenario, the exchange of communications demonstrates a clear agreement on essential terms, and the subject matter does not inherently necessitate a writing under Alabama's statute of frauds for a binding agreement to be formed at this stage. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes identifying the presence of a clear offer with definite terms, followed by an unequivocal acceptance that mirrors those terms. This involves analyzing the intent of the parties as expressed through their communications, and considering the specific requirements of Alabama contract law, including the distinction between offers and invitations to offer, and the nature of acceptance. Question 13. When evaluating a buyer's complaint in Alabama regarding a property transaction where the buyer alleges significant financial loss due to the licensee's failure to disclose a known material defect that was not explicitly covered in the listing agreement, which approach best assesses the potential for tortious liability? Option A. Assume that any financial loss experienced by the buyer automatically constitutes tortious liability for the licensee, regardless of the licensee's actions or adherence to professional standards. Option B. Conclude that tortious liability cannot exist as the issue is solely a matter of contractual obligation between the buyer and seller, as defined by the purchase agreement. Option C. Focus exclusively on whether the licensee acted in good faith, believing that a lack of malicious intent negates any possibility of professional negligence. Option D. Determine if the licensee's conduct fell below the standard of care expected of a reasonably prudent real estate professional in Alabama, leading to foreseeable harm to the buyer, irrespective of the specific contractual terms regarding disclosure. The correct answer is D. Determine if the licensee's conduct fell below the standard of care expected of a reasonably prudent real estate professional in Alabama, leading to foreseeable harm to the buyer, irrespective of the specific contractual terms regarding disclosure. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a real estate licensee in Alabama to distinguish between a potential tort of negligence and a mere contractual dispute. The licensee must assess whether their actions or inactions created a foreseeable risk of harm to the buyer beyond the scope of the purchase agreement, and whether they breached a duty of care owed to the buyer. Mischaracterizing the situation could lead to significant legal and ethical repercussions, including potential disciplinary action by the Alabama Real Estate Commission. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves recognizing that a licensee's conduct can give rise to tortious liability separate from contractual obligations. This approach correctly identifies that if a licensee's actions or omissions fall below the standard of care expected of a reasonably prudent real estate professional in Alabama, and this breach causes foreseeable harm to a client, then tortious liability for negligence may exist. This aligns with general principles of tort law as applied in Alabama, where a duty of care can arise from the professional relationship, independent of the contract. The Alabama Code and case law support the idea that professionals can be held liable for negligence if they fail to exercise the skill and diligence ordinarily possessed by members of their profession. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to solely focus on the contractual terms of the purchase agreement. While the contract outlines the agreed-upon services and responsibilities, it does not shield a licensee from liability for negligent conduct that causes harm outside the direct scope of those contractual duties. Alabama law recognizes that a licensee owes a duty of care to their clients, and a breach of this duty can lead to tort claims even if the contract itself was not breached. Another incorrect approach is to assume that any dissatisfaction expressed by the buyer automatically constitutes a tort. Tortious liability requires proof of a breach of a duty of care, causation, and damages. Simply being unhappy with the outcome of a transaction without evidence of professional negligence does not create a tort claim. This approach fails to differentiate between contractual remedies and tort remedies. A further incorrect approach is to dismiss the buyer's concerns by stating that the licensee acted in good faith. While good faith is a relevant ethical consideration, it does not automatically negate liability for negligence. A licensee can act with good intentions, but still fail to exercise the reasonable care and skill required, leading to foreseeable harm. The standard is objective, what a reasonably prudent licensee would do under similar circumstances in Alabama. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach such situations by first identifying the nature of the complaint. Is it a breach of the contract, or does it involve a failure to exercise reasonable care that resulted in harm? This requires a careful review of the licensee's actions and omissions against the established standard of care for real estate professionals in Alabama. If there is a potential for negligence, the licensee should consider the foreseeability of the harm and the causal link between their conduct and the buyer's damages. Consulting with legal counsel experienced in Alabama real estate law is crucial when tortious liability is suspected. Question 14. The analysis reveals that the governor of Alabama is considering issuing a directive to all state agencies to immediately suspend the enforcement of a recently enacted statute citing its perceived economic burden on businesses within the Commonwealth. This proposed action raises significant questions about the executive branch's authority in relation to the legislative branch's power to enact laws. Which of the following represents the most appropriate and constitutionally sound approach for the governor's office to take in this situation? Option A. Lobby individual legislators to introduce a bill to repeal the statute, while simultaneously instructing agencies to informally disregard its provisions. Option B. Issue a unilateral directive to state agencies to cease enforcement of the statute based on the governor's assessment of its economic impact. Option C. Seek a formal legal opinion from the Alabama Attorney General's office regarding the executive branch's authority to suspend the enforcement of the statute. Option D. Immediately initiate a lawsuit against the Alabama legislature to have the statute declared unconstitutional. The correct answer is C. Seek a formal legal opinion from the Alabama Attorney General's office regarding the executive branch's authority to suspend the enforcement of the statute. Explanation: the analysis reveals a scenario that is professionally challenging due to the inherent tension between the legislative and executive branches of Alabama's government, particularly concerning the implementation of new regulations. The governor's office, representing the executive branch, is tasked with executing laws passed by the Alabama legislature. However, the proposed directive to unilaterally suspend enforcement of a duly enacted statute, even if perceived as burdensome, directly challenges the legislative branch's authority and the established separation of powers doctrine within Alabama's constitutional framework. Careful judgment is required to ensure that executive actions remain within the bounds of constitutional authority and do not usurp the powers vested in other branches of government. The best professional approach involves the governor's office seeking a formal legal opinion from the Alabama Attorney General's office regarding the executive branch's authority to suspend the enforcement of a specific statute. This approach is correct because it respects the separation of powers by acknowledging that the executive branch's power to implement laws does not extend to nullifying them without legislative or judicial intervention. The Alabama Constitution vests legislative power in the legislature and executive power in the governor. The Attorney General, as the chief legal officer of the state, can provide an authoritative interpretation of Alabama law and the Constitution, guiding the executive branch on the legality of its proposed actions. This process ensures that any executive action is grounded in sound legal reasoning and respects the constitutional balance of power. An incorrect approach would be for the governor's office to issue a directive to state agencies to cease enforcement of the statute based solely on the governor's personal assessment of its burden. This is professionally unacceptable because it represents an overreach of executive authority, attempting to legislate from the executive branch and effectively nullifying a law passed by the Alabama legislature without proper constitutional process. This action undermines the legislative branch's role and the principle of separation of powers. Another professionally unacceptable approach would be for the governor's office to immediately initiate a lawsuit against the Alabama legislature to have the statute declared unconstitutional. While the judiciary has the power to review the constitutionality of laws, the executive branch initiating such a suit based on a perceived burden, rather than a clear constitutional defect, is an inappropriate use of executive power and bypasses the established channels for legislative review and amendment. Finally, an incorrect approach would be for the governor's office to lobby individual legislators to repeal the statute without any formal legal consultation. While lobbying is a legitimate political activity, unilaterally directing agencies to ignore a law while awaiting potential legislative action, without understanding the executive's legal standing, is a premature and potentially unlawful action that disregards the established legal framework and the separation of powers. The professional reasoning process for similar situations should involve a thorough understanding of the Alabama Constitution and the respective powers of the legislative, executive, and judicial branches. When faced with a directive that appears to challenge these boundaries, the first step should be to consult with the state's chief legal counsel, the Attorney General, to ascertain the legality and constitutionality of the proposed action. This ensures that decisions are made within the established legal and constitutional framework, respecting the separation of powers and promoting good governance. Question 15. Comparative studies suggest that real estate transactions involving properties located in foreign countries present unique challenges for licensees. An Alabama licensed real estate professional is assisting an Alabama resident client who wishes to purchase a vacation property in Spain. The licensee has limited knowledge of Spanish property law and customs. Which of the following represents the most prudent and legally compliant approach for the Alabama licensee? Option A. Proceed with the transaction by applying standard Alabama real estate practices and disclosure requirements, assuming they are universally understood and accepted in international property dealings. Option B. Rely exclusively on the advice and guidance of the Spanish real estate agent involved in the transaction, without conducting independent verification or ensuring alignment with fundamental ethical principles. Option C. Thoroughly research and understand the specific legal and regulatory requirements of Spain concerning property acquisition, while ensuring all actions and advice provided to the Alabama client are consistent with the Alabama Real Estate License Law and the Alabama Real Estate Commission's rules. Option D. Assume that the property laws and standard real estate practices of Spain will govern all aspects of the transaction, and that Alabama's licensing laws have minimal relevance once the property is outside of Alabama. The correct answer is C. Thoroughly research and understand the specific legal and regulatory requirements of Spain concerning property acquisition, while ensuring all actions and advice provided to the Alabama client are consistent with the Alabama Real Estate License Law and the Alabama Real Estate Commission's rules. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent complexities of international real estate transactions and the potential for conflicts between Alabama's regulatory framework and foreign legal systems. A real estate licensee in Alabama must navigate these differences while upholding their fiduciary duties to their client and adhering to Alabama law. The core challenge lies in ensuring that the licensee's actions, even when dealing with an international property, remain compliant with Alabama's licensing laws and ethical standards, particularly concerning disclosure and representation. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves diligently researching and understanding the specific legal and regulatory requirements of the foreign jurisdiction where the property is located, while simultaneously ensuring all actions taken within Alabama are fully compliant with the Alabama Real Estate License Law and the Alabama Real Estate Commission's rules. This approach prioritizes client interests by providing accurate and informed guidance, mitigating risks associated with cross-border transactions, and maintaining the licensee's standing within Alabama's regulatory framework. It acknowledges that, while foreign laws apply to the property itself, the licensee's conduct and professional obligations are primarily governed by their Alabama license. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves solely relying on the laws of the foreign jurisdiction, assuming they supersede Alabama's regulations for any international transaction. This is a significant failure because Alabama licensees are bound by the laws and rules under which they are licensed, regardless of the property's location. Failure to adhere to Alabama's disclosure requirements, for instance, could lead to disciplinary action by the Alabama Real Estate Commission, even if the foreign jurisdiction has different disclosure standards. Another incorrect approach is to assume that standard Alabama real estate practices are universally applicable without any modification or additional due diligence for an international transaction. This overlooks the potential for significant legal, cultural, and transactional differences in foreign markets. It can lead to misrepresentations or omissions of critical information that a buyer from Alabama might expect to be disclosed, thereby breaching fiduciary duties and potentially violating Alabama's deceptive trade practices laws. A third incorrect approach is to delegate all legal and regulatory responsibilities to the foreign real estate agent without independent verification, or ensuring the foreign agent's practices align with fundamental ethical principles. While collaboration is necessary, the Alabama licensee retains ultimate responsibility for their client's representation and ensuring the transaction is conducted ethically and legally to the best of their knowledge. Within the bounds of Alabama law, professional reasoning, professionals facing international transactions should adopt a risk management and compliance-first mindset. This involves 1. Clearly defining the scope of representation and understanding which laws govern which aspects of the transaction. 2. Conducting thorough due diligence on the foreign jurisdiction's laws and customs relevant to real estate. 3. maintaining open and transparent communication with the client about the complexities and potential risks. 4. Seeking expert advice, legal counsel specializing in international law, foreign real estate professionals, when necessary, but always filtering that advice through the lens of Alabama's regulatory obligations. 5. Prioritizing client protection and fiduciary duties above all else, ensuring that actions taken are consistent with the ethical and legal standards of their Alabama license. Question 16. The investigation demonstrates that a real estate licensee in Alabama is assisting a buyer from Canada who intends to secure financing from a Canadian bank for a property located in Alabama. The licensee is unsure whether to prioritize Canadian banking regulations or Alabama real estate laws when advising the buyer on the financing aspect of the transaction. Which of the following represents the most appropriate and legally sound approach for the Alabama licensee? Option A. Seek guidance directly from the Bank of Canada regarding the regulatory implications for the transaction. Option B. Prioritize the interpretation and application of Canadian banking laws, as the buyer's financing originates from Canada. Option C. Adhere strictly to the Alabama Real Estate License Law and its associated regulations, and advise the buyer to consult with their Canadian financial institution regarding the specifics of Canadian banking requirements. Option D. Focus on general principles of international commercial law, as the transaction involves parties from different countries. The correct answer is C. Adhere strictly to the Alabama Real Estate License Law and its associated regulations, and advise the buyer to consult with their Canadian financial institution regarding the specifics of Canadian banking requirements. Explanation. The investigation demonstrates a scenario where a real estate licensee in Alabama is faced with a situation involving a property sale with potential international implications, specifically concerning a buyer from Canada seeking financing through a Canadian bank. This presents a professional challenge because the licensee must navigate the complexities of ensuring compliance with both Alabama real estate laws and potentially international financial regulations without overstepping their licensing authority or providing unauthorized advice. The core of the challenge lies in identifying the appropriate sources of law and guidance applicable to such a transaction within the Alabama regulatory framework. The correct approach involves recognizing that while international agreements and customs can influence general principles of commerce, the direct regulation of real estate transactions and licensee conduct within Alabama falls under state law and federal law as it applies within the United States. Therefore, the licensee should rely on the Alabama Real Estate License Law, its associated rules and regulations, and relevant federal laws, such as those governing fair housing or financing disclosures, as the primary sources of authority. This approach is correct because it adheres strictly to the jurisdiction in which the licensee is licensed and the property is located, ensuring that all actions are within the bounds of established Alabama regulatory oversight. The Alabama Real Estate Commission's regulations provide the definitive framework for licensee conduct and transaction requirements. An incorrect approach would be to solely rely on Canadian real estate or banking laws. This is professionally unacceptable because Alabama licensees are not licensed or regulated by Canadian authorities, and Canadian laws have no direct jurisdiction over real estate transactions conducted within Alabama. Another incorrect approach would be to interpret or apply general principles of international law, such as customary international law or treaty provisions, as the primary governing framework for the specific details of the transaction or licensee conduct. While these sources inform broader legal principles, they do not supersede the specific statutory and regulatory requirements established by the state of Alabama for its licensed professionals and real estate transactions. Such an approach risks misinterpreting or misapplying laws, leading to potential violations of Alabama's real estate license law and disciplinary action. Professionals should employ a decision-making process that prioritizes the regulatory framework of their licensing jurisdiction. When faced with cross-border elements, the initial step is always to identify the governing state or provincial laws. If federal laws are implicated, they are also considered. International law or the laws of other jurisdictions are relevant only to the extent they are incorporated by reference or have a direct, recognized impact on the domestic regulatory scheme, which is rare for the day-to-day conduct of a real estate licensee in a specific state. In this case, the licensee's primary duty is to Alabama's regulatory environment. Question 17. Analysis of the Alabama Constitution's Equal Protection Clause in the context of a new state-mandated digital identification system presents a significant interpretive challenge. A state agency is tasked with determining the constitutionality of this system, which may disproportionately affect certain demographic groups due to access disparities. Which approach best ensures adherence to Alabama's constitutional framework? Option A. Examining the text of the Equal Protection Clause within the Alabama Constitution, reviewing relevant Alabama Supreme Court decisions interpreting this clause, and considering the historical context of its adoption as illuminated by state legislative records. Option B. Adopting an interpretation that aligns with current national political discourse on digital privacy and equality, regardless of specific Alabama case law. Option C. Prioritizing the perceived intent of the framers of the Alabama Constitution based on general principles of fairness, without specific reference to judicial precedent or textual analysis. Option D. Relying on recent interpretations of the Equal Protection Clause by the Supreme Court of a neighboring state, as their constitutional structures are often similar. Correct answer is A. Examining the text of the Equal Protection Clause within the Alabama Constitution, reviewing relevant Alabama Supreme Court decisions interpreting this clause, and considering the historical context of its adoption as illuminated by state legislative records. Explanation. The scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent ambiguity in interpreting constitutional provisions, particularly when applying them to novel or evolving circumstances. Professionals must navigate the tension between the foundational principles enshrined in the Alabama Constitution and the practical realities of contemporary issues, requiring careful judgment to ensure compliance and uphold ethical standards. The correct approach involves a thorough examination of the Alabama Constitution's text, its historical context, and relevant judicial interpretations by Alabama courts. This method prioritizes understanding the original intent and established legal precedent, ensuring that any interpretation aligns with the established legal framework of Alabama. This approach is correct because it grounds the interpretation in the specific legal authority of the state, adhering to the principle of constitutional supremacy within Alabama's borders, and respecting the established jurisprudence of its highest courts. It avoids speculation and relies on verifiable legal sources, thereby minimizing the risk of misinterpretation or overreach. An incorrect approach would be to rely solely on interpretations from other states' constitutions or federal court decisions that are not directly binding on Alabama law. This is professionally unacceptable because it disregards the specific legal framework of Alabama, potentially leading to conclusions that are not legally sound within the state's jurisdiction. Such an approach fails to respect the sovereignty and distinct legal traditions of Alabama. Another incorrect approach would be to prioritize personal opinions or the perceived spirit of the Constitution without grounding them in established legal interpretation or textual analysis. This is professionally unacceptable as it introduces subjectivity and bias, undermining the objective application of law. Constitutional interpretation requires a rigorous, evidence-based methodology, not personal conjecture, to ensure fairness and predictability. A further incorrect approach would be to adopt an interpretation based on popular sentiment or political expediency, irrespective of constitutional text or precedent. This is professionally unacceptable because it compromises the integrity of legal interpretation by allowing external, non-legal pressures to dictate outcomes. The role of a professional is to interpret the law as it is written and has been judicially construed, not as it might be wished to be. The professional reasoning process for similar situations should involve a systematic approach. First, identify the specific constitutional provision in question. Second, research the plain text of the provision and its immediate context within the Alabama Constitution. Third, consult relevant Alabama Supreme Court and appellate court decisions that have interpreted this provision or similar ones. Fourth, consider the historical context of the provision's adoption, if relevant, and illuminated by judicial precedent. Finally, apply these findings to the specific factual scenario, ensuring the interpretation is consistent with Alabama's established legal landscape and ethical obligations. Question 18. Consider a scenario where a real estate licensee in Alabama is assisting a foreign national who is considering purchasing commercial property. The foreign national mentions they are involved in an ongoing investment dispute that might fall under the purview of the Convention on the Settlement of Investment Disputes between States and Nationals of Other States, ICSID. What is the most appropriate course of action for the Alabama licensee? Option A. Advise the client that, while Alabama law permits foreign ownership, their specific situation involving a potential ICSID dispute necessitates consultation with an attorney specializing in international investment law and Alabama real estate law. Option B. Suggest the client rely solely on the Alabama Real Estate Commission's guidelines for foreign ownership, as these are the only relevant regulations for their purchase. Option C. Recommend that the client proceed with the purchase and address any potential ICSID-related issues if they arise at a later date. Option D. Inform the client that the ICSID Convention has no bearing on their ability to purchase property in Alabama, and they can proceed with the transaction without further concern. The correct answer is A. Advise the client that, while Alabama law permits foreign ownership, their specific situation involving a potential ICSID dispute necessitates consultation with an attorney specializing in international investment law and Alabama real estate law. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a real estate licensee in Alabama to navigate the intersection of state licensing law and international treaty obligations, specifically concerning property ownership rights for foreign nationals. The challenge lies in accurately interpreting and applying the principles of the Convention on the Settlement of Investment Disputes between States and Nationals of Other States, ICSID, within the context of Alabama's real estate transaction regulations. A licensee must ensure that their advice and actions do not inadvertently violate either state law or the spirit and intent of the treaty, which aims to facilitate foreign investment by providing a framework for dispute resolution. Misunderstanding or misapplying these principles could lead to legal repercussions for the licensee and potential harm to the client. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves advising the client that, while Alabama law permits foreign ownership of real estate, the client's specific situation, particularly their potential involvement in an investment dispute that could fall under ICSID, requires consultation with an attorney specializing in international investment law and Alabama real estate law. This approach is correct because it acknowledges the complexity of the situation, recognizes the limitations of a real estate licensee's expertise in international legal frameworks, and prioritizes the client's need for specialized legal counsel. Alabama law governs real estate transactions, but the ICSID Convention introduces an international layer of legal consideration that a licensee is not qualified to interpret or advise upon directly. Directing the client to appropriate legal expertise ensures compliance with both state regulations and the international treaty's implications. Incorrect approaches analysis. Advising the client that the ICSID Convention has no bearing on their ability to purchase property in Alabama is incorrect because it ignores the potential implications of the treaty on investment disputes, which could indirectly affect property rights or the client's overall investment strategy. While the Convention primarily deals with dispute resolution, its existence and the client's potential involvement in a dispute could have ramifications that a licensee is not equipped to assess. Recommending that the client proceed with the purchase and address any potential ICSID-related issues if they arise later is professionally irresponsible. This approach fails to proactively identify and address potential legal complexities that could arise from the treaty, potentially exposing the client to unforeseen risks and legal entanglements. Furthermore, it demonstrates a lack of due diligence on the part of the licensee, suggesting that the client rely solely on the Alabama Real Estate Commission's guidelines for foreign ownership without considering the broader international legal context is also an incomplete approach. While the Commission's guidelines are crucial for state-level compliance, they may not fully encompass the nuances of international treaties like ICSID, which operate on a different legal plane. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this situation should employ a risk-based decision-making framework. First, identify the core legal and regulatory frameworks applicable to the transaction, Alabama real estate law. Second, identify any potential external legal or international obligations that might intersect with the transaction, ICSID Convention. Third, assess the licensee's scope of expertise and identify areas where specialized knowledge is required. In this case, international treaty law and its application to investment disputes fall outside the typical scope of a real estate licensee. Therefore, the professional decision is to advise the client to seek expert legal counsel to navigate these complexities, ensuring both compliance and the client's best interests are protected. Question 19. During the evaluation of a client's Alabama Commonwealth tax return, a financial advisor discovers that the client, a resident of Alabama, has earned significant income from a business operation in Canada and paid Canadian income taxes. The client seeks to claim a foreign tax credit on their Alabama return to offset potential double taxation. The total taxable income for the client in Alabama is $250,000, with $100,000 of that income being sourced from the Canadian operation. The client paid $30,000 in Canadian income taxes on the $100,000 Canadian income. The Alabama income tax liability on the total $250,000 income before any foreign tax credits is calculated to be $15,000. What is the maximum foreign tax credit the client can claim on their Alabama Commonwealth tax return? Option A, $10,000. Option B, $15,000. Option C, $30,000. Option D, $6,000. Correct answer is D, $6,000. Explanation. The scenario presents a professional challenge due to the need to accurately calculate and report foreign tax credits, which directly impacts a client's tax liability and compliance with Alabama Commonwealth tax laws. Miscalculations can lead to penalties, interest, and damage to the professional's reputation. The core of the challenge lies in correctly applying the relevant tax treaties and Alabama's specific provisions for foreign tax credits, ensuring that the credit claimed does not exceed the allowable amount. The best approach involves a meticulous calculation of the foreign tax credit based on the lesser of the foreign tax paid, or the proportionate share of the Alabama income tax attributable to the foreign income. This method ensures compliance with the principles of preventing double taxation while adhering to the limitations set forth in both federal tax law, which Alabama generally follows for foreign tax credits, and any applicable tax treaties. Specifically, the calculation must consider the foreign income source, the foreign tax rate, and the taxpayer's overall income. The formula for the foreign tax credit limitation is crucial. Foreign tax credit limit equals foreign source taxable income / total taxable income. * Alabama tax liability. The actual credit claimed is the lesser of the foreign taxes paid, or the calculated limit. This systematic approach minimizes the risk of overcrediting or undercrediting, thereby ensuring accurate tax reporting and compliance with Alabama Commonwealth tax regulations. An incorrect approach would be to simply claim the full amount of foreign taxes paid without considering the limitation. This fails to acknowledge the principle that foreign tax credits are intended to offset Alabama tax on foreign income, not to reduce Alabama tax on domestic income. This can lead to an overstatement of the credit, violating the spirit and letter of tax law designed to prevent double taxation without providing an undue tax benefit. Another incorrect approach is to use an average tax rate across all income sources to determine the credit. This is flawed because the foreign tax credit is specifically tied to the income earned from foreign sources and the taxes paid on that income. Averaging can distort the proportionate relationship between foreign income and the Alabama tax liability on that income, potentially leading to an inaccurate credit calculation. A further incorrect approach would be to rely solely on the foreign country's tax calculation, without cross-referencing it against Alabama's allowable credit calculation. While the foreign tax paid is a component, the ultimate allowable credit is determined by Alabama's tax laws and the limitations imposed by tax treaties. Ignoring these limitations would be a direct violation of regulatory requirements. Professionals should adopt a decision-making process that prioritizes accuracy and compliance. This involves thoroughly understanding the client's foreign income and tax situation, identifying all relevant tax treaties and Alabama tax provisions, performing detailed calculations using the foreign tax credit limitation formula, and documenting all steps and assumptions. A review process, either internal or external, can further mitigate risks.